Welcome to our video lecture on topic 5.2, natural selection. Our essential understanding for today: the diversity of life has evolved and continues to evolve by natural selection. Our objectives: we're going to define what even is natural selection, we're going to identify sources of variation, describe consequences of overpopulation, define adaptation, and then we'll define and give some examples of vestigial structure. So natural selection can occur only if there's some variation amongst the members of the same species, and technically the same population. They need to be in the same space at the same time. This variation allows for some organisms to be more fit than others. So here we have some examples of finches in the Galapagos Islands, and we can see the variation in their beaks for sure, and then also some variation in coloration. Here is an amazing example. We have these super cute little guys. They're called rock pocket mice. And where they live, there are some spaces where it's a little more darkly colored. These lava flows made these strips of rock that are dark. And so it's hard for the birds to see the mice that are very well camouflaged. These guys that are less well camouflaged are more likely to get eaten. And so because we have this variation, because we don't have all the same critters all over the place, some are more suited to their environment. So you might be asking, where does all this variation even come from? Well, the biggest source is going to be mutation. So mutation is going to lead to new genotypes and new phenotypes. Most of those are going to be deleterious. They're going to be weeded out of the population pretty fast, but some mutations are super lucky and are going to give organisms a benefit. Meiosis is another source of variation. The crossing over that occurs during prophase 1 leads to new combinations of phenotypes, and this can lead to some adaptation. And then sexual reproduction, the recombination of alleles from different parents can also lead to new and interesting combinations of traits that give organisms some kind of benefit. Working out is not a source of variation. Just because your parents work out or got plastic surgery or dye their hair is not going to have any impact on their offspring, right? So not a source of variation for what we're talking about here in class today. But interestingly, there was a guy before Charles Darwin. So Darwin is our natural selection guy. Before Charles Darwin, we had this guy named Lamarck. Ooh, that's okay. Lamarck was like, you know what? I think that giraffes are getting taller because they are stretching their necks. So he was pretty sure that this giraffe ancestor, who was a little bit shorter, stretched his neck to get the juicy leaves in the tops of the trees. Because he stretched his neck, he had babies who had longer necks. Those babies stretched their necks and had babies with longer necks who stretched their necks until we finally get the long-necked giraffes that we have today. This was a good idea at the time, but we definitely have better ideas now. So Lamarck and the acquired traits being passed down. So Lamarck thought that acquired traits that you acquired during your lifetime, could be passed on to your offspring. And we know now that that is not the case. So adaptations are characteristics that make an individual more suited to its environment. So we're going to call this fitness. Fitness is not like I worked out and so now I'm very strong and fit. Here in biology class, we're talking about fitness, the ability to make more babies. And this is exactly what natural selection is all about. So natural selection and Charles Darwin is that adaptations that make an individual more suited to its environment are more likely to pass on those traits to their offspring, which means that we're going to have more babies with more of that trait. And as we change the frequency of traits over time, this is evolution. And this is particularly evolution via natural selection. So natural selection, some traits are more suited for the environment. They're more likely passed on to offspring, which means that they're going to increase in frequency in that population over time. So maybe one of the coolest things I think about evolution, natural selection, is that some traits that aren't necessarily helpful anymore, the adaptation might be to let them go away. Some mutations that reduce these structures because they're no longer necessary can be passed on to offspring. So one of my favorite examples, whales have hip bones. So they've got those little bones just kind of floating around helter-skelter in their bodies, not attached to a pelvis, not attached to leg bones, just some leftover pelvis. Snakes have tiny little leg bones, tiny little leg bones here. Little bits stick out even on the outside of their bodies. Clearly snakes don't have legs, but their ancestors maybe did. And so how cool is this? So vestigial structures, leftovers from ancestors. We have some of our own vestigial structures, right? Our tailbones, our appendices are things that aren't necessarily helpful for us anymore, but were at some point in our ancestry. Often in nature, there will be an overproduction of offspring. So animals, plants, organisms will have offspring as much as they can. This is going to lead to a struggle for survival. The more offspring there are, and resources aren't necessarily increasing at the same rate, we're going to have some organisms not survive. The more fit the offspring, the more likely they are to have babies and pass on those traits. And again, fitness, we're talking about the ability to survive in the environment, the ability to pass on their offspring, pass on their traits to their offspring. So an example of this super cool is the peppered moth. And these were studied in England quite a bit. So pre-industrial revolution, the trees had light-colored bark, and the light-colored moths blended in quite nicely. The darker colored moths were less well camouflaged, and so they got eaten. More often, their population was a smaller number than was the lighter colored moths. Post-industrial revolution, we covered the trees with soot, and so the trees became a darker color. The darker colored moths were better camouflaged. The lighter colored moths were the guys that stood out and got eaten. And so in a fairly short amount of time, the number of light-colored moths decreased dramatically. The number of dark-colored moths increased dramatically. And this was all due to the struggle for survival. Who's going to evade the birds? Who's going to survive to pass on their traits to babies? And as the environment changes, the ability to survive might also change. So a trait that was less good before could be really good when the environment changes. This is another thing for us to consider in climate change, what organisms are going to be able to adapt to a warmer planet, to more extreme weather events, and which of us species are going to be less well ready to survive in those different environments. Carrying capacity is this maximum number of organisms that we think can be supported by an environment, and overproduction of offspring is going to cause a few too many organisms to be produced, and then some will die off, but then there will be more resources, and then they'll have more babies, and then some will die off because there are too many. And so in reality, we never hit that carrying capacity line. Us humans just kind of average that number out to a lovely little plateau. So we're pretty sure that the carrying capacity for most organisms exists. We do wonder sometimes about carrying capacity for humans. Is there a carrying capacity for us humans on Earth? I don't know. So it's a big question, right? But carrying capacity is that maximum number of organisms that can be supported by an environment. As the environment changes, that number, that carrying capacity might change too. And we did it, my friends. We define natural selection. This is going to be organisms better suited to their environment are more likely to survive and have babies, passing on those adaptations, those traits to their offspring. We talked about sources of variation. Mutation, meiosis, and sexual reproduction are our sources of variation. Acquired traits in Lamarck, not so much. We described the consequences of overpopulation. There is going to be a struggle for survival. Organisms with adaptations that make them better able to survive and have babies are going to do that. Then we also defined and gave some examples of vestigial structures, which are so cool. Good job today.